On now to news about a very high-level visit. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dymtro Kuleba is visiting India. He is expected to ask Indian authorities to help invest in rebuilding of the country and also extend more humanitarian assistance. India has been navigating its relationship with Russia and Western allies backing Ukraine.
India continues to not condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a stance rooted in a long history of friendship between Delhi and Moscow. Ties nurtured by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's met Russia's Vladimir Putin nearly 20 times since 2014. India's hostile neighborhood forces it to play a balancing act between Russia and the West, the biggest threat from China, pushing up against India's borders and trying to influence its neighbors. Russia is India's largest weapons supplier, and outright support for Western positions or sanctions on Russia may leave India isolated in the region. Delhi has repeatedly called for a return to diplomacy.
We have been very clear. My Prime Minister has stood next to President Putin and has said that we do not believe that this is an era of war. We are today for resolving this conflict. We want to see the end to this conflict. But we believe that every conflict finally ends in some kind of, people come to the table. That's how conflicts end. I mean, you can also decide a conflict on the battlefield, but we don't think this conflict will be decided on the battlefield.
India also benefits economically from its neutrality to Russia's war in Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion, India has gone from purchasing hardly any Russian oil to becoming a major importer. It has been able to navigate Western sanctions on Russia. American officials have avoided openly criticizing India. US President Joe Biden sees the Indian Prime Minister as a strong ally in the Indo-Pacific region, a reliable partner to counter China. This situation frustrates Ukraine, which has been seeking outright support from India, something that continues to test India's tightrope act.
All right, let's get more on this with our correspondents, Nick Connolly in Kyiv and Nimisha Jaiswal in Mumbai. Good morning to you both. Nick, if I can come to you first, what is Ukraine hoping to achieve with this visit?
Well, I think Dymtro Kuleba is not arriving in Delhi today with a long wish list as he would have if he were in Brussels or Washington. I think the Ukrainians understand that they're not going to get Indian sanctions on Russia or some kind of, maybe weapon supplies. Obviously, India is the biggest buyer of Russian and previously Soviet weapons, so there's lots of stuff there that Ukraine would want. That's not on the table. I think it's about bringing the Ukrainian narrative, the Ukrainian message to the Indian public, saying that this war is not just some kind of proxy conflict between the US and Russia, that this is about the democracy, Ukraine, and that should appeal to the world's most populous democracy. That's the Ukrainian view on this, and to also remind people that Russia is the former colonial power in this part of the world trying to reassert its control. And I think people here are acutely aware of the fact that Russia has been a lot more successful in bringing its messages across in the so-called global south, away from Europe and North America, and that Ukraine has for a long time neglected trying to bring these messages across.
Nimisha, India has so far maintained a studied neutrality on this issue. Can we expect the Indian position to shift at all?
Well, to answer that question directly, Viresh, I don't think so. India has stood by dialogue and diplomacy, but it's also carrying out a balancing act. We talked about the historic relationship with Russia, but there is a need to look fair to Ukraine too. This invitation in itself stands out. This is the first foreign minister visit from Ukraine in 7 years. The last one, interestingly, was in the shadow of the Russian invasion of Crimea, where Ukraine appealed to India to send peacekeepers to the Donbass. So this kind of dialogue has happened before. India has said, like what mentioned in the piece, that this is not an era of war. It stands by dialogue and diplomacy, but it will not unilaterally condemn Russia. I think that's safe to say. And it insists, it reserves the right to maintain its own perspective. As recently as last week, Foreign Minister Jaishankar said he views India and Russia's relationship in a very positive light.
Nick, back in 2022, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dymtro Kuleba said, and I quote, "Every barrel of Russian oil delivered to India has a good portion of Ukrainian blood in it." What has changed since then for Kyiv?
Well, I think obviously they would prefer those Russian oil exports to India to end, but that's not happening. I think they've moved in their kind of vision on all this towards trying to make sure Russia earns as little per barrel as is possible. They don't necessarily mind Indian refineries making money from processing Russian crude oil. And also they've seen with delight in Kiev how Russia has struggled to use the rupees it's earned, now having increasing difficulties processing dollars. Russia is having to accept payment in other currencies, including the rupee, which isn't freely convertible, and is now having to look for wares and services to buy in India with those rupees that are basically parked in Indian bank accounts. So I think it's more about trying to keep worldwide oil prices low, making sure that Russian oil doesn't stop flowing and then mean higher costs for Ukrainians, but also in the US, where there's also a big worry that higher oil prices could get Donald Trump re-elected, which wouldn't be good news for Ukraine, and just trying to make sure that India doesn't provide banking services, other things that would help Russia more widely to get around sanctions in the way that China does.
Nimisha, Russia will also be watching this visit very closely. What hangs in the balance for India?
Well, definitely the relationship with Russia is really important. And when I mentioned the balancing act before, last week when, for example, Prime Minister Modi called the Ukrainian President Zelensky, he also called the same evening the Russian President Putin to congratulate him on his 5th term. And tweets went out about both these conversations the same evening. And we've talked about oil, we've talked about weapons, but looking at the bilateral relationship between Russia and India, last December, the foreign minister met with President Putin, a difference in status that isn't usually seen, but it was an effort to reiterate India's commitment to the relationship with Russia. There used to be an annual summit between India and Russia for 2 decades that Prime Minister Modi has missed the last 2 years. It was reiterated that he would show up for the next one. And we also have a BRICS summit upcoming in Russia in October that Prime Minister Modi is expected to attend. So definitely it is important for India to show how committed it is to its relationship with Russia. Interestingly, on that visit of the foreign minister to Russia, he said the India-Russia relationship is the only constant in world politics in the last 60 years. And that's quite saying something which we can't expect one visit to change.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for joining us today. Nimisha Jaiswal in Mumbai and Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you both very much.